Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.
Alongside to me today is Cody Spencer. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So I guess to get started, if you just love to just share your backstory, because I've heard it previously and I really like it, and it would be awesome for the audience to hear.
Yeah, so my name's Cody Spencer, and I am a bison rancher, an agroecologist, and a land steward. My story really starts in southern Alberta, so that's southern Canada, western Canada. For those who aren't familiar with North American geography, we are just north of the Montana border, so Glacier Park, just to the north of that. So my family had a farm just north of that Montana border when I was young. So growing up, I lived in this, sort of bucolic agricultural setting. I had all the space in the world to explore and, build tree forts and go-karts and all the stuff. And it was really quite an amazing childhood. But it was a conventional farm, and my parents, they farmed in that system for about 20 years. And around 2002, I was about 12 years old, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened, in our family dynamics. Farming was really tough. The drought really hit us hard, and my family decided to sell that farm. And for me, that was sort of a devastating experience, because that was all I had ever known. At the same time, I had all this space to roam and explore my surroundings, but I was never really connected to the farm, because there's a lot of machinery, a lot of machinery. There's something about the land and the crops that we were producing never really resonated with me. But where our farm was situated, it was at the base of this vast plateau of native grassland that stretched to the west 100 miles to the front of the Rocky Mountains to where Glacier Park is. And I had several experiences going out onto those native grasslands with my mom in particular, who loves horses. And so we would ride up onto this vast expanse of native grassland. And something about those experiences just really stuck with me. We would get up onto this plateau and you could see 50 miles in every direction. And it looked as if it would have 200 years ago, wild herds of elk and pronghorn antelope and deer browsing in the valley, sharp-tailed grouse, and all these beautiful native plants. And that, I didn't know at the time what it was that really stuck with me. But as I grew older, we moved away about an hour outside of a medium-sized city called Lethbridge, and I was sort of disconnected from the land, and just going about life the way that that we do in modern society. Teenager, doing all the stuff, graduate high school, figure out what do you want to do with your life. And so I went to college for a year, didn't like that. Got into the trades and got a welding and carpentry. Got experience in those trades, which was great. But then at a certain point in my early 20s, and I'm 34, by the way, I was born in 1989. And, in my early 20s, I was looking for something more, and I wanted to do something really meaningful with my life. And I just kept being pulled back to the land. And around that time, I suppose it would have been 2008, 2009, I got back into hunting, because I grew up hunting with my dad around our farm and on those landscapes. And those were also some of the most formative experiences for me, just being out, this excitement with my dad and guns and animals. And then we'd get the deer and we'd go skin it and butcher it as a family. And we had sort of a tradition making sausage, and all the people from the community would come in. And I just loved those experiences. And so I was like, I'm going to, we haven't done this in a few years since we moved from the farm, but I'm going to figure out a way to get back into hunting. And so I did that, and I got a bow, and that first year I harvested this really nice mule deer buck, and I haven't even come close to anything since. And it was just this surreal, psychedelic experience that was like, oh man, I need to figure out a way to spend my life on the land. And as those years went by, in my early 20s, I came across a book called Portraits of the Bison by a guy named Wes Olson. And I started flipping through this book, and I was just dumbfounded. Like, wow, these animals, these bison are so incredible. And everybody sort of knows the story of, bison were in the millions, the tens of millions, and they nearly became extinct. We had less than 500 left by the end of the 1800s. And then, they sort of made a comeback, and reading this book, it's like, wow, what a story. Where are they? Why aren't there more of them? This was a question that kept coming back to me. Why do we not have more of these animals? And so I started to explore that question of, why don't we have more bison on the land? And nobody really had a good enough answer for me. So I kept going deeper and deeper, and eventually found my way to a couple of bison ranches locally in southern Alberta that I was looking first to buy the meat. I wanted to try the meat because I had never eaten the meat before. Got some of the meat. I was like, this is amazing. This is some of the best meat I've ever had in my whole life. And right there, I was hooked. I knew that I needed to find a way to work with these animals. So what I did when I was about 23 or 24 is I quit my job and I went to work on this really big cattle ranch. It's about a 50,000 acre cattle ranch.
Wow.
On the Alberta-Montana border. And I was gaining ranching experience with the intention of working with bison. That was always the goal. And so I worked there for a little while, and then found my way into one of those bison ranches and started working there and started working with these animals. And this was, pretty decent sized ranch for our area. It was about 12,000 acres, and there was a few hundred bison. And it just gave me this opportunity to get to know these animals and sort of cut my teeth in grassland management and rangeland management. And the owner was such a good guy, and he allowed me to start a herd of my own on the land and sort of run them in with his herd, which allowed me to start my own little meat business. And so I did that starting in about 2014, and really built up my experience and just kept learning and learning and learning. For me, what bison represented in managing bison on these native grasslands was like the confluence of all my interests coming together. I'm really into history. I'm obsessed with geography. I love being out on the land. I love animals. The rangeland management and the grassland management was this whole new incredible rabbit hole that just got me hooked. And so all of these experiences, I knew I had something here, and I knew I wanted to continue to pursue it. And a part of that, I was essentially, I guess you could say fifth generation in agriculture. Like, people like to throw that out, whatever generation you are. But I was starting over because my family had sold the farm, and that was the right decision and everything. But to start over, I had to figure out, well, how do you do this? Like, how do you actually do this and be able to make a living and to be able to continue to improve the land? And I had so many questions still. So the deeper I got, the more questions I had. And that eventually led me in about 2016 or 2017 to holistic management. And holistic management is, I'd say one of the disciplines of regenerative agriculture, one of the original sort of streams of regenerative ag that came from Alan Savory starting in the 1970s and evolved over the decades, and really focused a lot on grassland management. But what holistic management is this decision-making framework, which the foundation of is identifying what it is you want your future to be like, and what sort of quality of life do you want to have? And then checking all of your decisions against what you have defined. And so eventually that sort of spins into this entire land management and grazing management plan and strategy that's very adaptable, and people have had incredible results of, regenerating, massive ecosystems using holistic management. So for me, that was this amazing resource to be able to deepen my learning. And from there, this network of people who have already been practicing this for decades just opened up a whole new world for me. And that was my entry into regenerative ag. And so I knew, okay, so this whole bison thing, I'm on board. I'm committed to bison. But, this regenerative ag thing married with bison ranching really does provide this viable pathway to make this work. And then, you follow that a little bit deeper and you discover, wow, there's actually a few bison ranches that have been practicing holistic management, regenerative ag over the decades. You can maybe count them on one or two hands. There's very few of them. And so it was like, well, I need to go visit those places. I need to see how they have done it. So I, started to expand my network that way. And eventually another turning point in, it was 2017 as well. I went to a workshop on soil. And at that time, 2017, a few years into my journey, I started to feel like I had a handle on how to manage grassland. And I was like, okay, yeah, I've discovered holistic management. I know a bunch of the grass species. I've done this for a few years, and I'm feeling pretty confident in my experience and abilities. And so I went to this workshop just sort of not really knowing what to expect, and I got in there, and this woman is standing at the front, and she's from somewhere like Australia or New Zealand. I had no idea where. And her name was Nicole Masters, and she got up there and started talking about soil and how soil is a living, breathing superorganism. And I, at that point, knew that, okay, yeah, we've got some bugs and some creepy crawlies in the soil, and they're doing their thing, but whatever. But that moment was like a punch in the gut, because before that, I didn't grasp the gravity of how soil biology is actually driving the system. Soil microbes are what we need to be managing. And it was a 2-day workshop, and if anybody's familiar with Nicole Masters and the work that she does, we usually spend a day in the classroom, and then and a little bit in the field, where you dig a big soil trench and you look at the soil profiles to see what's going on, between, the carbon layers and all the different minerals and the root systems of the plants. And after day one, I was so overwhelmed with what I heard in that workshop, and knew that I needed to spend the rest of my life dedicated to learning this stuff and figuring it out and practicing it. I didn't even go to the second day of the workshop because, and I'm embarrassed to say that now, but I mean, I was so blown away by this fact that soil is a living, breathing superorganism, that I went up into the mountains and I just camped for the night by myself to try to process what I had just learned. And that sort of has set the stage for the last, I'd say, 5, 6, 7 years of my life. So I've talked a lot. I'll leave it there. You can ask any questions that have come up from that.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. And before talking all things bison, because I know that's going to be the meat of the discussion, I wanted to briefly talk about just your upbringing, and specifically, as you mentioned, growing up on a conventional farm. I'm curious with your parents, and you mentioning that you're restarting, but mentioning that you technically would be the fifth generation. I'm assuming that they were just taught the conventional methods, or how was that process like for your parents whenever they first, I guess, inherited the farm?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to step back to it was on my dad's side, and my dad's mother, she was the first generation to grow up in agriculture with the chemical system. Chemicals really started to come in the late 1960s, 1970s is when they started using chemicals. And so for her generation, they were the first ones exposed to that, whatever you want to call it. We'll call it a system. But my grandmother, she died of cancer at 42 years old, 2 years before I was born. And there's some stories, I guess, that I've heard about her generation in that agricultural town, there was a huge percentage of them all died of cancer very young. And so that sort of set the stage, I think, for this system that my dad inherited. He was definitely his whole life in agriculture. They were in that system. They were, in the northern Great Plains, were a pretty dry environment, and they had started to what the chemicals allowed them to do was to move away from tillage every year. The wind, it's one of the windiest places on earth, and so when you expose that soil, that dry soil, to the wind, it'll just blow away. And think of the Dust Bowl, think of all those things. All that stuff happened in the 1930s, and then it's actually happening again today, for another story. So my dad carried on with that system for about, I guess he farmed for almost 20 years in that, and that was all he ever knew. And in the 1990s, you got to remember that in cropping, Gabe Brown was not around yet. He was still cutting his teeth and having his disasters happen to him in North Dakota the same time that my dad was farming in that similar system. And so there was no examples in cropping for how to do anything different. And so they went along with what what everybody else was doing, so to speak. And my mom is much more of an animal person, but my dad's a machinery guy. He's a mechanic. He loves that kind of stuff. And so he loved farming. He loved farming in that system. It just wasn't working for him. Like he just wasn't making enough money. And, with droughts and, now in hindsight, I can get into how my dad has circled back into agriculture now and is like this huge soil health advocate. But now, reflecting back, those soil health practices were just devastating, and they were not setting us up for resilience. And so it's easy to see why it wasn't working.
I'm curious, did it affect your health at all growing up, being surrounded by that?
I don't think so. It's a good question. I don't know if I've really reflected on that. I would say that where our farm was situated, downwind of this essentially large block of native grassland that didn't have any chemicals sprayed on it. And, I wasn't, out there doing it myself. I was too young. And no, so I don't think so, but you never know. In this day and age, we're exposed to so many different environmental toxins. It's tough to really pinpoint, where the issues are coming from. So yeah, I don't know.
I know that the cancer thing is really big because, for example, I know Mitch Hendricks, who was the one that connected us to, whenever I spoke with him, how he mentioned that he grew up on a farm in Nebraska that's conventionally farmed, and he's not taking over that farm just because of the conventionally raised agriculture surrounding that whole entire area and just how pretty much depleted it's been because of all of the chemical sprays. And then I read a story a couple weeks ago, I forgot where in Alabama, but again, this one town, the cancer rates just skyrocketed, and then they actually sued Bayer and won, and it was one of the largest lawsuits in its history. And so you just see more and more of that, and it's quite disgusting. So yeah, I guess my next question, you mentioned that on the Dust Bowl stuff and saying how it's happening now too. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah. If anybody is paying attention to agriculture across North America, right now we are seeing these massive dust storms again, enveloping the sky. And so these are usually in areas that are still practicing heavy tillage. And there's a lot of places. Generally, it seems the higher the rainfall, the more people are doing tillage because you can get away from it. A lot of, say, the northern Great Plains and some of these drier areas, I'd say the Great Plains in general, moved to no-till production throughout the 80s and 90s as chemicals like Roundup allowed them to do that. Instead of terminating weeds through tillage, they can spray it and plant their crop directly into crop residue, which allows them to cover the surface, which is one of the principles of soil health. So, there's obviously negative effects of applying herbicides in that system, but at least you can cover the soil. So what we're seeing is places that are still tilling, which, in my area, in certain areas in, let's say, Alberta and Western Canada and even the Northern Plains, crops like potato production require heavy tillage, very heavy tillage, because you have to, till to prepare the seed bed and plant it, and to harvest it, they're growing in the ground. You actually have to disturb it and work that soil up. So as soon as you do that and expose it, and on the Great Plains, we have these crazy winds that can just take the soil and move it and put it up into the air and erode it so quickly. And in fact, there's been, over the last 2 years, several like big devastating events in, I think, Illinois is where I've seen where these interstates are completely blacked out from the erosion, or from the wind picking up this soil, and people are getting in car accidents and dying on the highways because they can't see, because the Dust Bowl 2.0 is happening. And so, while we have all this regenerative agriculture happening and this really promising movement, we still have all of these problems possibly amplifying at the same time.
It's interesting you mentioned Illinois, because actually now I think about this, back in 2022, I worked on a farm in Pennsylvania, and one of the other guys that was helping out, he's actually from rural Illinois, and he mentioned all of this stuff too, and just the heavy sprays and just the smells of all of that, and the smells of just mismanagement from just awful cow manure, but then also the winds. So yeah, it's really interesting, but also obviously terrible. That's really all I had then, and I think this would be a good segue then finally talking to all things bison, because for me, I mean, bison's the logo of Regenaissance. I was vegan, and then whenever I switched back in 2021, I remember I was in Whole Foods and was just getting typical meat, and I remember seeing a Force of Nature stand, and I had bison, and I was like, whoa, I don't think I've ever had bison in my life. And then I bought some, such as yourself. I loved it, and then to me that started down the rabbit hole of, I love history too, and so I just read a lot about that and just became fascinated with them. And then especially as an American, the history of the bison, and again, how they almost went extinct. I think before talking just about your experiences and everything you'll be doing, would love to talk just the bison itself. If you could just shed some light on the history, especially in the context of the plains in America and ecology, because of how amazing they are for us, that would be great.
Yeah, so where to start? I was just reading this book by Dan Flores, a new book by him. He's an incredible author, a natural history author, and he wrote an amazing book called American Serengeti, and his new book is called Wild New World. And so it traces the history back of our megafauna, hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And so the story of the bison starts in Asia, and bison went through many different forms of evolution before they migrated onto the North American plains across the Beringia, between Alaska and Russia. And so that was about a few 100,000 years. And so bison are relative newcomers to our continent compared to a lot of the other species. And bison went through these phases in the ice ages. They were much bigger. Bison latifrons, bison antiquus, these massive animals. The latifrons, the big bulls, could weigh up 4,000 to 5,000 pounds, and their horns were like 6 feet wide, crazy huge. And so as the climate sort of ebbed and flowed and shifted over the years, they evolved down into what they are today, which is bison. That's the plains bison. And there's two subspecies in North America. We have the wood bison in northern Canada and Alaska, and we have the plains bison. And so the plains bison are what everybody thinks of when they think of, you guys like to claim them as the American bison. We'll let you get away with that for now. But they roamed basically the entire continent of North America, Canada, all the way down into Chihuahua, Mexico, and even all as far east as the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and Canada. So people don't realize how far east they actually were, and they were just eliminated quicker from the east as Europeans moved into that country first. And, as far as their ecological context, over those tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, they became the dominant grazer. As some of the other species started to go extinct, like the mammoths and some of those other species, bison stepped into that niche as the primary wide-mouthed grazer that runs in large herds. And they run in large herds for many reasons, but to keep an eye out for predators, the idea that strength in numbers, like if the weak get taken out, you still have this mass of animals to weather and keep moving on. And as far as their impact on the ecology, those large herds, you can think of, most people have heard stories from people like Lewis and Clark and a lot of these early explorers and frontiersmen who left journals saying, we encountered a buffalo herd. It could have been 1 million animals. We don't know. The sight of them didn't end. There was tens of miles long, passed for 3 days without seeing the actual soil. Just these insane numbers. And so these herds could have been, anywhere from tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of animals in one mass moving across the land. And you can imagine the impact that would leave on a landscape as they move across. They're grazing, they're moving quick, they're being pursued by wolves, and they're urinating, they're defecating, so their manure and their urine and trampling. Dead animals are falling behind them. And so there's just this massive cycle of nutrients converting those tall grass and midgrass prairies, cycling it back into the soil so the biology can continue to turn it over. And that's what built the fertile Great Plains in North America, is that process. And a key part of that was when they went through and they, I'm going to call it devastated a landscape, short-term devastation. It would have been totally leveled. That land would have had the opportunity to rest and recover for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even longer. And so that disturbance and the recovery of the plants is what allowed that system to really build up this fertility and this carbon over the years. And then of course you had grass fires that came through and helped cycle that as well. And all of these different processes were sort of naturally functioning in tune with indigenous people, pursuing those animals, keeping them on the move as the wolves would, and they themselves setting these fires and sort of they were managing this ecosystem in their own way.
Can you talk more on on the controlled fires too? Why that's needed and just the effects that have?
Yeah, fire can be an incredibly destructive force or a tool, but it can also be really beneficial. And so when we think of it in terms of a grassland, especially in brittle environments, and so this is another distinction of Alan Savory in holistic management. One of his key insights is that every environment on the planet falls somewhere on a continuum of brittle and non-brittle. And so non-brittle being the distribution of rainfall is consistent throughout the year. So think of a rainforest. It's always getting rain. Vegetation's always green and growing. And that nutrient cycle is always happening because the biology is active and they're able to process and turn over, leaves and plant material constantly. So then you have the far extreme of non-brittle environment. If you think of Sahara Desert, maybe one of the most extreme environments on the world, it almost never rains. And so the distribution of rainfall is very, very sporadic, very sporadic. And so there's almost no biological activity happening on the soil surface. And so every environment falls somewhere on that continuum of the brittleness scale. And so if we look at the North American plains, the grasslands, where I live, we get about anywhere between 12 to 18 inches of precipitation per year. It can fall, most of it falls in, say, April, May, June, maybe into July. We have dry seasons. And so, we're not without rain, but there are dry periods, and it does get droughty. And so we might fall somewhere on the 7 on the brittleness scale, not too extreme, but enough rainfall to support this vegetative community. And so in these brittle environments, you can think of biological activity. It's not really happening all the time. When we have a rainy season, biology will be active and cycling nutrients. But when it's dry, the only biological activity that's happening is in the gut of the ruminant. So in the rumen of that ruminant animal, like a bison, that's where the moisture is. That's where the biological activity is to be able to cycle nutrients. And so looking at a grassland ecosystem, you say you have that disturbance event and it's obliterated and it grows back, say, for 2 years or so, and depending on the environment, the amount of moisture, so on, at a certain point that grassland has become overgrown, and you have too much plant material that's grown over multiple seasons and is covering the soil, which is great up until a point. But you hit a point where that plant material is actually shading out the soil surface and preventing new plants and new growth of grasses and things like that from actually coming up. And you leave that too long without grazing, and you'll start to see these plants dying from the center, and bare ground starts to increase. And this is the process of desertification. And so, a part of that historically would have been fires would have swept through those dry, overgrown grasslands and, essentially scorched it off, but probably not too hot, and cycled, of course, a lot of carbon would have went up into the atmosphere as smoke, but a lot of it would have been incorporated back into the soil, providing nutrients for new growth to shoot up. If anybody's ever seen a prairie fire and the results after, the flush of growth can be quite amazing. And so, it's removing that, that cover, that mat that's blocking the sunlight from hitting the soil. It's adding those nanocarbons from the soot, allowing biology to use that and all the other minerals and nutrients to be able to revive the grassland. So fire and grazing are intimately tied when it comes to the ecology of the Great Plains.
Dang, that's very cool. And it's just another reason why I like agriculture so much is just the whole system is just so fascinating how it's all intertwined. Because then, like you were saying, with fire can be bad, and then also not grazing can be bad, but then on the flip side, fire can be great, and then if properly managed, the grasslands are just incredible. Yeah, it's just really awesome. And
Yeah,
so I want. Oh, go ahead.
add on just the sort of where fire can be destructive is, when we think of a lot of our forests and even some of our grasslands, we have suppressed fire for so long that the fuel buildup is so extreme now, where historically you would have had smaller, less intense periodic fires kind of come through, just sort of take off that, that surface mulch, and or in a forest, it would have kind of ran through some trees and set them back, opened up the canopy. But now we've suppressed fire to the point, and everything is getting hotter and drier to the point where now we have these mega fires that have the potential to just completely devastate, ecosystems and civilization.
Is there a reason as to why we're just letting those lands just build up essentially?
Yeah, it's probably a more complex topic than I can speak to, but we're fundamentally afraid of fire. I think as I think European culture has moved in, and fire's bad, fire's all these things. It was a very important tool for indigenous people to manage these landscapes. They would do controlled burns constantly because that's where they would burn a landscape, and that's where the first place where animals would move into because of the fresh green growth. So they used it as a tool for so long. For us, I think, I say us, people of European descent. I also am part indigenous North American as well, a small percentage. So I like to try to, bridge between the two worlds. But in general, we view timber as something to extract, to log and extract, which, I'm not against logging by any means, but, so a fire, having a fire come up and burn through our timber that we could be cutting and using for wood doesn't really, make sense in that paradigm. Maybe rightfully so. Same goes for forage. If you burn a grassland and, that's grass you can't graze, it might be a bit of a short-sighted approach to it, but I think a lot of that plays into it. And I think, I just think there's a general fear around fire that it's this bad thing.
And that's why I was glad that you explained that, because I didn't really know a whole lot about controlled burns, but how you described that makes total sense. So I want to transition a little bit to whenever you first got your first herd of bison, because I've had a lot of folks on that have talked about whenever they started their cow operation or lamb or chickens or turkeys, but not really bison just yet. So I'd love to hear what that process was like when you first got your herd, and essentially, I guess, what would the day-to-day be like? Because I know that's probably different than as you're growing your chicken operation or a cow operation.
When I first got my bison, it was on an existing operating ranch, and so I was already managing that herd. More or less, the infrastructure was in place for grazing, fences and water and things like that. There was a lot of opportunity to improve that, so I was constantly, building the infrastructure and improving it as well. But so day to day for me, I would, when I would show up at the ranch, basically, we'd have one herd of bison, and depending on the growing season and what time of year it was and all that, we'd go check the animals, make sure that nobody's sick or hurt or whatever. And with bison, we found that we've had very little issues with disease or injury. Just they're very hardy animals. We always want to make sure that they've got mineral. So like a loose mineral, or salt, we might bring that to them, and make sure that they've got water. And beyond that, we're looking at our overall grazing plan within the context of that ranch, and where do we want them to be? What types of grasses do we want them to be grazing at a certain time of the year? And so, as a general rule of thumb, when you're looking at grazing, especially on these native grasslands where we have this vegetation that's adapted to our environment over thousands of years, but we do have places where other grasses are introduced. They usually come from Europe or Asia, things like that. And people thought that they would be better for, North America, for better or for worse. Often some of those grasses we can utilize earlier in the season. So earlier in the spring, earlier in the growing season, those grasses tend to take off, where the native grasses, they know they've been programmed over thousands of years to wait until they know that it's not a drought. And if it's a drought, they'll continue to kind of hold off, and that's how they conserve their resources. Where these introduced grasses, they'll just explode, as soon as spring hits, and any moisture, it'll just take off, and they're generally more resistant to grazing during that critical period. And so we want to try to hit those species during that time, allowing the native grasses to grow well, ideally all through the growing season. And later in the season, the native grasses tend to hold more nutrients, and so that's why these buffalo herds could actually winter without anybody feeding them or anything like that, and manage to make it through an entire winter just digging through the snow and grazing those grasses, versus the introduced grasses. Generally, once things go dormant or the rain shuts off, it turns to cardboard, and it's got minimal nutritional value. And so we're always looking at, where do the animals need to be at a certain point, and so we're moving them to different pastures. Depends on the context again. Maybe I'll get into what we were doing at Rome Ranch in Texas, where I managed for a few years down there, and we were moving every day to up to every week type of thing, again depending on the season. Whereas on some of these larger landscapes, we'd move less frequently. But a general principle is that when the grass is growing at its peak growth, the faster the grass is growing, the more we want to move. And so this is another principle of regenerative grazing, where we we don't want to stay too long in a paddock when the grass is growing, because they'll take a bite and then they'll go walk over here for a little while. And in about, depending on the rate of the growth, in about 3 days, that plant that they had bitten has now grown up a little bit. It's used root reserves, energy from its roots to fuel that growth and start to recover. And if that animal has not been moved on as they historically would have moved on, they'll come back to that spot and they'll graze it again, because it's nice, green, lush growth. And the moment they graze that second bite, that is the definition of overgrazing. And so we're always trying to eliminate the possibility of overgrazing. And now this is, it's much more of an art than it is a science, but that's essentially, as grazing managers, that's our highest leverage activity, is to be always, managing that optimal rest and recovery thing. So yeah, day to day, bison are pretty easy, I would say. And especially if you compare them to cattle in certain ways, calving season in a lot of cattle operations is this, 24 hours a day for a month straight, and everybody wants to play victim of how hard it is and all this stuff. And it's like with bison, you literally have zero work and they just go do it themselves, as they always have. And so that's pretty amazing.
On the topic of overgrazing, say that bison comes back and has that second bite. What are the negative implications of that?
So as they come back and they take that second bite, so that grass plant, if you can imagine, it's got a few inches of growth and it's got a root system that, say, mirrors it, or maybe it's bigger or shorter, but it's got a root system. And so that first grazing, it clipped it down to here. And so it drew some of its root reserves. And so it shed some of its roots, took some of its energy back up to fuel that growth, and so the root system shorter, it comes back, the bison comes back and clips it again, even shorter, and draws the roots down. You do that enough times, and you do that over years and decades and centuries, and essentially that desirable grass plant will get to the point where it dies out completely. And that's where you start to see, a lot of this bare ground, compaction, because there's no longer root system there to keep the soil aggregated, no longer a mycorrhizal fungal association, all those things. And so then that provides the opportunity for invasive species and annual sort of shitty, undesirable plants to move in and take over.
No, that makes sense. I wanted to talk to you more on the logistics side of bison too, with bison management. On the infrastructure side, is that how is that compared to, say, the infrastructure for a cattle ranch?
Yeah, so the first thing to talk about is fences, of course. Well, let me start with water, because water is always, no matter what sort of system you have, the most important piece to get right. Now, if you have your water systems dialed in, where you've got a good distribution of water throughout the entire property, and good troughs, good things like that, good flow, reliable, all those things, that's really not much different between bison and cattle, except depending on, if you have sort of a flimsy, chintzy trough, the bison will probably break it quicker than cattle would. So getting the water right is the most important thing, I would say. When it comes to fencing, that one is a little bit different with bison. They are more athletic. They can, they can jump fences, as do cattle. But in general, what it comes down to is, if you are managing your bison in a way where they're constantly stressed, they've got poor quality feed, or it's overgrazed and they don't have feed, and if they have bad water and no mineral, then they're going to be looking for a way out. And that's no different between bison, cattle, sheep, any animals. With bison, if you get them into that position and you force them into that position, they will look to jump fences and they will look to get out. So a lot of people who take that approach to management, they will build this Jurassic Park fence 10 feet tall, and there's no way, no matter what, that the bison could actually get out. And so you could starve them to death in that type of pasture. The way that I like to approach it is have good water, have really good grass, have very low stress, and have good minerals, and get away with a fence that's much closer to an existing cattle fence. Because a lot of the properties that I go on to, we're often starting with a cattle fence, right? Cattle usually have been raised on that property, and so I'm approaching this right now. We're actually setting up a new ranch with for bison, and so I'm looking at the fences and saying, okay, how good are they to start with? How quality? How are they 100 years old, falling apart, and the wires are rusted? Well, I'm going to need to do some rebuilding here. Or are they brand new, solid cattle fence that maybe all I need to do is add a single wire of electric fence onto it and sort of adapt it to what bison need? And so generally, like, we can get away with anywhere from a top wire from 50 to 54 inches high, all the way down to say 42 inches. Usually for interior sort of cross fencing and subdividing, we'll go lower around that 42. As long as it's electrified, and bison respond well to electric fencing, it's a really valuable tool for us to manage them across the land. I would say that those are the biggest differences. Is if you're managing well, you can get away with less, but you have to be on top of it, and you have to have this relationship with your animals. Really, these principles, everything we talk about with bison is interchangeable with cattle. They're all, they're closely enough related that they can actually breed and produce a semi-viable offspring. And so the concepts are the same, but bison hold their natural instincts a little bit more. And handling facilities like corral systems generally need to be a little bit more beefed up, a little bit higher, because again, they can jump higher. And if you're a very good stockman or low stress animal handler, then you can get away with less. But again, that comes down to the skill of the practitioner and how well do they know those bison, and how in tune are they with their needs to be low stress. Because then you can really get away with very little if you're dialed in. But that takes years.
Yeah, I've seen some wild videos of them jumping on the corrals and whatnot, because then it makes you realize just how high they can actually jump. For land, because in the context of just their natural grazing patterns and how big they were, how much land do you ideally need to have just to start a bison ranch, essentially?
Oh, what a question. So completely dependent on the region that you're in. And so, let's play around with this a little bit. So say in the eastern part of North America, things are generally greener, longer, produce more higher rainfall, producing more forage per acre. And so you need less land in general to support let's just call it one animal. Where I am, it's a little bit colder, it's a little bit drier. We need more animals. So, let's just say in the east, you need 1 acre per head for an entire year, and then where I'm at, you might need 12. Where you're at in Texas, where I've managed and know the environment quite well, it actually might be similar to my environment, just because of the sporadic rainfall and the extreme heat. So it's really dependent. People will take a tiny chunk of land that's a couple acres and put a bison on it in essentially tiny feedlot, and feed them hay all year, all the way to you can have the American Prairie Reserve in Montana is looking to get 3 million acres for their bison herd. So it can be anything in between. It all depends on what your goals are and your environment. How much grass can you produce per acre? And with your management, you can improve that. But each environment sort of has its set of limitations based on all the different factors of the geography and the climate. You can pick that apart a little bit, and we can bounce that around, because I think it's an important point for anybody who is interested in starting a bison herd is really knowing your context and knowing what your landscape can produce. And in the US, you've got a lot of good data to show, how much forage that land that you might be looking at can actually grow. And so that's a good starting point to go off of. But we see anybody start small bison herds on, could be 100 plus acres. I mean, again, it could be less, but then you get into a system that's very degenerative and unprofitable. The more that you're sort of feedlotting and just feeding expensive hay, it doesn't really work economically. But if somebody's goal is just to have a bison there to be able to look at them and they don't care about the health of the land, you can really have them on any piece of land. But if you really truly want to develop a regenerative bison system, I'm going to say the more the better, the more land the better. And I want at least a few hundred acres to be able to work with, to be able to get a herd going and to support enough animals that, if you're starting a meat business, that you can have enough scale to be able to produce enough animals to be able to sell and actually fund this thing, versus another system that is just requires cash thrown in every single year, and it's totally unprofitable.
So mentioning Rome Ranch in Texas, which is the force of nature, and you worked there for a couple of years.
Yeah. So we were there from early 2018 to the end of 2020.
And then I guess, would you be open to just sharing what that experience is like and what, I guess, everything that you were doing with them?
Yeah. So we were brought down as ranch managers. I say we, my wife and I. A key part of my journey as well was, as I was selling my bison meat, I started selling in this local organic grocery store locally, and my wife bought the store. My future wife bought the store, and one day I walked in and here's this woman, and we hit it off, and so that's how we got together.
That's awesome.
It's a pretty great story, and we still go there to this day. And so my wife and I, at that point, we had the opportunity. Rome Ranch, we had known who they were through, so Katie and Taylor, through Epic. They developed Epic Bar, sold it for ungodly amounts of money, and then wanted to get into bison ranching. So they bought a ranch near Fredericksburg, Texas, about an hour west of you in Austin, and wanted to try this thing. And you can probably count on two hands, again, the amount of people in the world that know regenerative bison management or have experience in it. And I saw the posting for a ranch manager, and I responded, and it was sort of a perfect fit. And so we went down and checked the place out, and yeah, it was going to be cool. They were starting from nothing. They bought this property, but had a lot of money from the sale of Epic, and so they're willing to essentially invest in improving the land through applying regenerative agriculture principles. And so we got a visa. We moved down 2018 and got to work, moving bison, applying holistic management to regenerative principles, seeding cover crops, and seeing what we could do. And it was actually a very incredible experience to have, I don't want to say unlimited resources, but basically the whole goal was to be able to see how we can improve land with bison management and cover crops and multi-species stuff. But we could get into that. There are some benefits of it, but generally what I found to be pretty unprofitable. And over the years they had bought this land, and so we started to lease more land adjacent to this core, I'm going to say 600 acre property on the Pedernales River. And we had a little bit of irrigation, which proved to be key to weather some of these extreme drought periods and summer periods where essentially everywhere else shuts off in growth. And, we don't have any feed anywhere else except on this irrigation. And so we would use that as the anchor, so to speak. And so that 60 acre pivot produced probably upwards of 70% of the forage on maybe like 10% of the land base. And so, which was, sort of problematic in a sense that we leaned a little bit too heavily on that irrigation without considering the parasite loads that the bison were under. Because, so if you'd imagine bison back to, them grazing on the plains historically, they would have grazed an area, and these parasites that, exist on the soil and exist in their bodies, they shed it onto the ground through their manure, and then they move on. They don't come back. We were constantly going back onto this irrigation, and these are also parasites, internal worms that are not native to North America. These are from Asia and Africa. And so we would be coming back too soon on this grass, and the bison would ingest those parasites. And that became a real problem for us to try to work around. And so we had to bump up our recovery periods, longer recovery periods. So, the parasite would hatch and then go through its entire life cycle, and the grass would grow taller. And so by the time we came back, the bison were not putting their mouths onto the soil surface or close to the surface where those eggs are, and they're actually just grazing the tops of the plants. And so some of those things is how we tried to get around that. We did a lot of sort of trials around reseeding native grasses and restoring riparian areas, which to varying degrees of success. Some of the land there was the poorest land I've ever seen in my life, and to try to seed cover crops, let alone native species, was an exercise in futility. But some of the areas around the creeks where they were, healthier already, we saw a rapid response when we would graze and we'd let it recover, and you'd see the tall grass native species pop back up. There's a lot of really interesting things that we tried while I was there. I'm sure they've done a lot more since. And for me to be able to, to play a role in applying that and seeing what worked and what didn't was a huge opportunity for me. And so by the time the end of 2020 came around, we had an incident where the bison broke out, and they got across the Pedernales River, and they got across the highway 290 to the south. And anybody who knows the hill country, that's a busy highway. It's a pretty touristy area. So by the time we discovered where they were the next day, they were across the river, across the highway on somebody else's property. And so what ensued after that was probably the most stressful. And I mean, like, I had to dig deep for 3 days to get, take apart our corral system at the ranch, set it up on some property where the guy he was pretty pissed off that we were going to use his property to get these bison. And finally, after, 3-4 days, we got all 125 head back into the corrals and trailered them back to the ranch. We didn't lose any animals. And it was like, wow, holy shit, that was crazy. And about a week later, we were fired from the ranch. So my wife and I, we had a 1-year-old. We had a 1-year-old son, and we were 6 months pregnant with our second son. And so this was November of 2020. And so we were without a home, we were without a job, and we were tasked with moving 1,500 miles back north up to Alberta. And so that became one of the most difficult periods in our life.
Dang. I guess with that, because this is just not interesting. This is just the aspect of just agriculture too, that the unpredictability that adds stressful times like this. I'd just love to hear what did you do next in this venture after that? Yeah,
good question. We were really, and what a weird time too, because COVID was still full on. And at that point, Texas had sort of circled back around to, okay, we don't really care too much about this. And then when we went home, Alberta is sort of the little brother of Texas. We try to think we're the Texas of Canada. But when we got back, it was still like, lockdowns and this crazy time. And so we still had a bison herd up here that we had started, and my brother was managing it. So we leaned into that. We basically got regrouped in preparation to have our second kid. And, we had to shore up our income, and we had to look for different opportunities. And my wife and I reflect on it quite a bit, as on one hand, it was definitely the most difficult time in our lives and our relationship, but it allowed us this sort of space to, I mean, reconnecting with our families who we had been away from for 3 years, and to spend a lot of time with them and help them through some really difficult times as well. It was, we look back on it as this very special era in our life. And so really it was, we collectively as a family were able to sort of help each other get back on our feet. And where that landed us was, I continued to raise bison, and then really just broaden my, because I knew like this was my world. And also, so like the more experience I had at Rome Ranch around the soil piece, I knew there was so much that I had to learn. And so it allowed me this opportunity to go back and really study soil at the deepest level that I possibly could, which gave me the opportunity to start studying and then working with Nicole Masters, which has sort of been this last few year chapter of my life. And so I'd say that whole event was this disturbance event where it's like everything is shaken to the core, and what do we do next? And then the recovery piece of it allowed us to look back at what we had defined in our holistic context as, what do we want our life to be like, and how do we have to act to get there? And for me, it allowed me the space to dive deep, just to keep moving forward in that direction, and deepening my knowledge, just establishing more of an authority around this regenerative space. And yeah, I honestly, it was as tough as it was. We look back on it like, like everybody does in these types of experiences, like one of the best things that could have happened to us.
I mean, like we said on the phone a couple days ago, whenever I briefly met you at the National Bison Conference last year, but then literally a week later, right before I was going to start on Rome Free Ranch, ending up in the hospital, my near-death experience that brought me back to Austin, which inevitably led me to Regenaissance now, to where I now truly feel where I need to be. And so, yeah, it's wild, because that was the scariest day of my life, and that ended up being the biggest blessing in disguise of my life. So it's funny how life can work out that way. I'm really curious too, because we, with bison, almost went extinct, and now it's still growing. But then, like you were saying, where are the bison still? So I would just love if you could just shed some light on just the current climate of just the bison community in America. Because I know with cattle, for example, it's continuing to really grow, especially with the grass-fed and finished. There's more and more investments being piled into that industry. Yeah, if you could just talk more on just the current climate of bison ranching, and if it's growing, or yeah, because I know for the listeners, I haven't really talked much about the bison world yet.
Yeah, and bison ranching is a pretty new industry, relatively speaking. I mean, really started, I guess, in the maybe 1960s. There was a few private herds. It's always been private individuals who have saved the bison from extinction, and then governments have come in after the fact. And so there's always been quote unquote bison ranchers ever since the 1800s. But really, as a meat industry, has only sort of taken off in the last 30 years, I would say. In the 1980s, people started to get into it a little bit more, and in the 90s, even more so. And then there was this real run up of prices towards the end of the 90s. And there was a big bubble because, everybody got excited about bison, and a lot of ranchers got in, but there was no real meat market to back it up. it was always considered, and I think it still is considered by the USDA to be an exotic animal, which is very ironic, isn't it? That they're the least exotic animal that we have. But so it was always viewed alongside like ostrich and alligator as this weird sort of fringe meat, right? Fringe food. The idea that it would be a dominant part of somebody's diet was pretty foreign up until recently. And so through the 2000s, it was so after that bubble burst in the late 90s, early 2000s, the bison market like was totally tanked, and consumers didn't really care about it. But as the 2000s progressed, there was, the awareness around bison as a legitimate meat source started to grow, and more people, either they weathered the storm from the 90s or started to get in during that time, and really built up this consumer awareness around, this is a legitimate protein source. And I would say since I've been involved with bison since 2013. The awareness has, I don't know how to put numbers to it, but doubled, tripled. It's way more than it was when I first started researching of how do I do this. It's like there was very, very few resources on how to approach bison ranching and direct marketing. And we had a big run up in the price of bison from 2012 to 2019. And then when COVID hit, it tanked. The whole industry tanked because a lot of it was tied to restaurants and export markets to Europe and things like that, which depended on restaurants. And so the price from the producer side has been really poor the last 4 or 5 years, and only now is it really starting to recover. In terms of numbers of overall animals and populations, you'll hear a number out there that there's about 500,000 bison in North America or in the world. Only maybe 20 to 30,000 of those are in wild herds or conservation herds, and then the rest are on ranches. So most of them are on private ranches. I've seen some stats recently that number might have decreased a little bit. So I think we actually have somewhere around 450,000 bison total. And I don't know where that's going to end up in the next few years. I see the demand continuing to grow. People like me, people like you, we're now, I'm 10 years into this, and I would say that as far as the amount of calories that I eat, like my diet is probably the majority of my calories come from grass-fed bison, and I'm in the best shape of my life. I feel amazing. And I only see people like us continuing to drive that demand up. And I don't see on the producer side, I don't see us meeting that demand. Now, at this point, I feel like we're in this weird period where, we're still sort of coming off the hangover of COVID, and the production is down and prices are depressed. But in the next few years, I see this as an incredible opportunity to get into bison, and we need more producers who are doing it right, raising regenerative bison. And there's a real opportunity for people. This is something that anyone can do it. Like it's not easy. It's like I've been on this for 10 years, and I'm essentially starting over from scratch again this year, which is, we can talk a little bit more about, but anybody can do this. And that's the important point. We need more people back on the land. We need more people, especially people who have amassed some resources from other businesses or jobs or whatever over the years and want to invest it into land and want to build up something meaningful and produce healthy food and be connected with the bison. And one of the most rewarding things about raising bison that I never would have guessed was being able to bring people out and get them connected with the herd, with the land, with their food. And we did a lot of that at Rome Ranch. I've done a lot of it elsewhere, and it's one of the most meaningful parts of this for me. And for somebody who's interested in starting a small herd, within earshot of a major city, there's such a big opportunity for that.
So before talking about all of that and everything that you're doing right now, I would love to talk about because you mentioned there's only a few that are doing it regeneratively. If you could just talk about the similarities and differences between the bison ranchers that aren't doing it regeneratively versus the ones that are.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to like are you looking for and measuring indicators of ecosystem health and managing towards those goals? Or are you not looking at that at all and just letting the land do whatever it does under a potentially degenerative system? And so what I mean by that, the people that are doing it really well are they have goals around their land and how they want to improve it. Whether it's looking at their water cycle, whether it's looking at their forage production per acre, species diversity, all these things, soil health, organic matter, carbon, whatever it might be. These are all metrics that we can use to manage towards. And to achieve that, there's all sorts of different strategies depending on the context, but a lot of it comes down to optimizing this disturbance and recovery period to get a long enough recovery period on the plants for them to regenerate. And that's what we see a lot of producers missing the boat on, is that you know for whatever reason, and bison can be harder to handle than cattle, or they're not exposed to any sort of regenerative principles. But we find that a lot of bison ranches are just set stocked, quote unquote, where they'll be in the same pasture for months on end or maybe the entire year. And in that sort of a system, it's just inevitable that the land becomes degraded. It's overgrazed, it's compacted, water can't infiltrate, bare ground increases. And in that system, economically, it doesn't work, because then if you can't grow the grass, then you're trying to purchase in feed, and feed is completely uneconomical to feed to your animals and even attempt to make a profit. So you have to be maximizing the amount of solar energy you're capturing on your own property through your management. And so that's the difference with some of these regenerative operations that we work with, and that I've been on and manage, and all those things, is that we have goals around ecosystem health, and we're constantly moving towards them with the idea that if we can say double our water infiltration, then it's likely that we can double the amount of forage we can produce per acre. And that really drastically changes the economic equation, because if you can produce double the amount of animals on the same land base without actually having to, increase infrastructure, that equation is really one of the only ways to make a viable operation work.
I think that's a great segue into, you're saying you're starting over again. If you could just talk about that too.
Yeah. So I mentioned that when we came back from Texas, we had a bison herd, and so this was on a ranch that we leased from a family, and it was a really good situation for 5 years that we had our animals there, and we did some pretty amazing things with that land and with the animals, but we never really had security in that land base in a lease agreement, and quite frankly, it wasn't a location that we wanted to live, and where we decided that we wanted to live was an hour and a half away from that ranch, and for a variety of reasons it ran its course, and we decided to this last summer to sell our herd there. And so since then, I've been working towards setting up a new ranch where we can continue to build, and we can build the operation of our dreams. And so this year, so we're searching for animals right now to be able to put onto this ranch. But I have formed a partnership with an older ranching couple who have this beautiful 4,500 acre ranch, and have really been looking for somebody like me to partner with, to take over, essentially, because they're old, their kids have moved away. This is a common story within agriculture and ranching, where the younger generation has moved off to the cities and don't really want anything to do with it for whatever reason. And so with this couple, we're gonna start small with bison, and run bison and cattle together on the same ranch, and see if we can build up the bison herd and the component to maybe one day they'll be the larger component. livestock on the ranch, and I'm really quite optimistic about it. There's a few things for me that are really important about this. We need more viable pathways for people like us to get back on the land. And because the narrative out there is that young people can't get into agriculture. It's not, you can't make a living doing it. You can't acquire land. You can't do all these things. And so, for me, I want to prove that out for myself. That's always been my dream. And my goal would be to eventually own this ranch potentially. And, you know, one of the other things that really excites me is that this couple, they have done an incredible job regenerating this land with cattle over the last 45 years that they've been on the land. And so now it's at the point where, often you move on to a property and it's been abused and it's been degraded. This place is like paradise. There's grass galore and beautiful pure spring water coming out of the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and it's just so perfectly set up to be able to build a business off of, a meat business where you're producing nutrient dense healthy food. There's no chemicals, there's no none of that stuff. It's pure native grasslands with crystal clear spring water coming out of the Rockies. And so that really excites me to be able to build back a direct to consumer bison business, as well as potentially other enterprises, looking towards different things like hunting, tourism, carbon, ecosystem services. For somebody that has skills to regenerate land, there's going to be all sorts of opportunities around those types of things. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. We're just adapting, some of the infrastructure back to the fencing piece earlier. Seeing what is existing and seeing what we need to adapt with electric fence to be able to get going with a bison herd. And another point, a context piece, where this ranch is in the foothills of the Rockies. We have massive elk herds, and I mean like 600 to 800 head in one herd of elk just running wild across these lands. So if I were to go in and I were to build fences that were 6 feet tall, not only would it disrupt the migrations of the elk, they would just plow through it, and it would be constantly fixing fence and just a total nightmare. So then for us, it's like, how do we design these systems so that, it works for wildlife, it works for migrations, and yet we can do what we need to do with the bison on the land. So that's quite a fun challenge.
Very cool. I'm curious too, then, because you've also mentioned for folks that have made money from certain investments or businesses, or just folks that might be interested, because I'm trying to figure out how to form this question, because I know this is also what you're trying to do, is just with all the different land management and a lot of unused land essentially, and trying to connect that with just connecting bison ranchers together, but also just trying to get more folks into the space. For someone that might be interested, what are some good first steps they should do? If there's any good resources, or should they just go visit a bison ranch and work on it, kind of like what you did? Yeah, I'd just love to hear your advice for that.
If we're talking bison specifically, is that what you're asking? Is
Yeah.
bison? Yeah, bison specifically. There's a few things that I would start with. I would get the National Bison Association's Bison Producers Handbook. It's a great resource to get started, learn about bison production, all aspects of it. I would get connected with the National Bison Association or Canadian Bison Association and the regional, each area has its own regional network of people, and they always have conferences and different field days and things like that. So I would do that first. I would go take a holistic management course. I would look it up online, whether it's through the Savory Institute or Holistic Management International. Go find one of the regional hubs in your area and take one of those courses and read the holistic management book. That's I view it as foundational to anything in agriculture, or even if you're a human being living on this planet, to read that book. Beyond that, I would take the ranching for profit school to really get dialed in on how you are going to make this work as a business to be able to cash flow it and be successful. Holistic management and ranching for profit come from the same origin, but they have sort of split over the years and taken slightly different paths. Holistic management is focused more so on the land piece than it is on the finances, but it includes the financial piece, financial planning. Ranching for profit, sort of the inverse. It's more business focused, and then the land piece is included, but much less of a focus. So those two, no brainers. And then beyond that, I offer consulting, coaching services for people who, really in all aspects of agriculture, but definitely in grazing, ranching, and bison ranching is obviously my specialty. So I do personalized one-on-one coaching with people, and yeah, I would say that's a great resource because, we've got experience over the last 10 years that can save people hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars in mistakes and actually help make them money from the start. So yeah, I'd reach out to me. Currently I'm working on a regenerative bison book, so that should be out next year. And so I would those are probably enough resources to get started. And then there's an immense amount of books and podcasts. Like, don't limit yourself to the bison world. Look at the broader regenerative movement, especially the regenerative ranching movement. Listen to podcasts like Working Cows and Herd Quitter and Ranching Reboot and some of those shows that are talking to ranchers, because so much of the information that's out there, people on the cutting edge, it's relevant to bison. It just hasn't really been practiced enough yet. So that's where I'd tell people to start.
Thank you. And then also for the folks that don't necessarily want to ranch themselves, but might have the additional capital to invest in, because this is one thing that I really hope happens in the future as agriculture overall is really starting to pick up steam. Noticing more and more people are talking about it, but obviously not everyone's going to want to do that, nor are they really equipped to have a ranch long term. Where could they go to, I guess, try to see if they could invest in a ranch or farm, or just for folks that might have additional capital that they want to invest in for this agriculture space? How could they go about that?
Yeah, good question. I think for those type of people, before jumping into anything, you get really excited about something and you want to invest in it immediately, I would spend a lot of time on resources like Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast and that whole network. That's a big one. There's some groups out there like Steward, they're lenders for regenerative projects, and I think groups like that, they're already actively out there generating projects, and they take outside capital to help fund those. Those are really important. If you're interested in bison, investing in bison in particular, I'd say get a hold of me first, and we can have a conversation about what your goals are. And then, we have quite a broad network of people in this space, and depending on where you want to go with it, we can help point you in the right direction.
Cool. So I have one last question. It's not directly tied to what I just asked, but through your 10 years of working and being on the land and observing bison, what are some of your favorite aspects of bison?
So for people that have had spent time around bison, there's some sort of like magical X factor that they have. And when people describe it, they say, well, I've caught the bison bug and there's no getting rid of it. There's something so captivating about these animals. They're truly incredible. So it's very difficult to explain, but when you are in the middle of a bison herd and they are out there on the land and they're grazing and they're moving across in this herd-like mentality, their herd instinct is so strong, they move across the land like a like a school of fish moves through water. And to just sort of see that flow happening throughout the land, it's, to me, one of the most remarkable experiences. It's the most remarkable experience I've ever had. And that I became addicted to that sensation. It was almost surreal, and again, very psychedelic, where it's like, is this real life? I can't even believe that this still exists in our modern world. And yet here I am in the middle of this. I'm a part of this system. And so to just be up close and they make these amazing sort of grunting sounds. They don't moo, they don't have any annoying moos or anything like that. It's all, this very deep primal sort of grunting and communication that they have between the herd. And probably my favorite moment is when you're sitting in the herd, early in the morning, late at night, just before dark, and the bison are peaceful. They're, the stress is low, and they're grazing, and they move their head down to the soil, wrap their tongue around the grass, and rip it out. And it's that sound of them grazing and pulling that grass and chewing it and moving on. You can hear their hooves sort of massaging the soil. To me, that's peak life. There's nothing better than that.
I love that. And I can relate to a lot of that because, again, going back to the National Bison Association conference last year, that was the first time I had really seen bison in person. And they're just so majestic. They just have this powerful aura around it to where it really draws you in, which is why I'm still pretty bummed that, obviously, I'm really happy with what I'm doing now, but I was going to be working on a bison ranch. And long term, I know, however long I work with Regenaissance, after that, I'm going to start my own bison ranch just because I'm so drawn into everything about them, and everything that you described too is just, they're so fascinating.
Yeah, and again, I mean, back to anyone can do this if they have the passion. Like you can do that, Ryan. And we're here as a resource for you if you need us.
Appreciate that. So thank you for joining. If there's anything that you'd like to plug before we go, now would be a good time to do that.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot more writing on LinkedIn, so you can check me out on there. I'm not on any other social media platforms right now, but yeah, having a lot of fun putting out some good content there, and that'll sort of evolve. And I'm working on a couple projects, like I mentioned, the Regenerative Bison book, and then also a project around, how do we, as say our generation, get access to land, to be able to develop regenerative businesses. And this is a big burning problem. This is a huge challenge. We've got hundreds of millions of acres are going to be changing hands in the next couple decades. So the question is, how do we funnel that land into the stewardship, into the hands of people who are going to take good care of it, produce healthy food, health, clean water, all of these things. And so it might evolve into a course, definitely some coaching around, like if somebody's into, if somebody's committed to this, they want to figure out how do they get back to the land? How do they develop a business and a lifestyle connected to the land and within regenerative agriculture? Then we are here to support that person, to support you one-on-one. And then also, this might evolve into a course that people can take and get strategies to get clear on, what do you truly want? What are you seeking? And how do we get there? Because, you hear a lot of hype around, and I just listened to your Joel Salatin podcast. Love Joel Salatin. He's inspired me for many years. But it's like, yeah, you just go out and you get chickens and you move them around and you do all this stuff and you can start your own business, and that's great. But you should probably try that out first before you launch into it, because you might not want to actually raise chickens, right? And so really, we're seeking clarity on what it is that we truly want, and then we can work on strategies of how to get there, how to connect with existing outgoing landowners, how to maybe identify the right property for you to purchase or lease, and some of those things, because there's a lot of mistakes that a lot of us have made that I think we can streamline this process. So yeah, so there's that. If somebody wants to connect with me, they can just go to my website, codyspencer.land. They can book a Calendly 15-minute call. You can text me 403-632-7159. You just get a hold of me directly. And yeah, and so back to that land access piece. I'm going to be doing a lot of interviews with people to get their stories of how they have accessed land and how they've built inspiring lifestyles on the land. And so that will probably evolve into a podcast, and I'm leaning towards Back to the Land with Cody Spencer. So I'm just recording interviews right now and banking those and seeing where those will go. But look for that. I'll put that out on my website and probably LinkedIn. Maybe I'll expand the social media following a bit. But yeah, I'm just excited to have more of these conversations and to see how we can grow this network of people who are deeply committed to making a difference on the land. And if you're doing it with bison, that's bonus points. Last thing, there was a film that was made about me and my bison and a friend of mine called All Among the Bison. And so you can just look that up on YouTube and watch it. It's a great little film.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Cody. I really appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Ryan.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.